Well, I think what we have is an audience of citizens, some of whom are fortunate enough to receive a salary to provide services, but all of whom I think are citizens in different ways. So everybody lives in a neighborhood somewhere, and is a resident, and some volunteer. So there's always gray, isn't there? There's a mix. But I think one of the things that's important to think through is the question of power. And it seems to me that one of the challenges that we have is that if we live in a world where people think that their health is in the hands of a professional solely, or their security is in the hands of a professional solely, that they're missing a trick in terms of their own power and agency. But they also run the risk of really putting a huge amount of burden and pressure on paid professionals, because the doctor can't do it all on their own. So I think what I suppose the dilemma or the challenge that we have to try to work out is, if we're in a situation where the role of the citizen is being defined as that which happens after the important work of the professional is done, then we're in a one up, one down relationship. And I don't think anybody in the room wants that. So I think in a democracy, the whole idea is that the role of the professional is defined as that which happens after the important work of the citizen is done. So the role of the professional is in servant leadership. Our job isn't to treat citizens as clients where we just go and do an audit to find out what they need and then stuff them with services. That's not a good model. That's not a good social contract. So I think if we're fortunate enough to be paid, then the first thing is we must do no harm and not institutionalize people. Our job is, we're in the enablement business. So how do we lift people up? But if that's the case, it's also really important that as citizens, we recognize we have work to do as well, that we can't just outsource our work to professionals and say, here, you sort out my security for me. You sort out my health for me. I have neighbors who have mental health issues. Well, I'll send them over there to the people who deal with that in service land. I think what we've got to try to do is we've got to try to recognize that all sustainable change is like a 3-lane swimming pool, where there are some things in the first lane that simply are best done by communities, by families, and by citizens themselves. And the job of paid people is to remove the barriers and to make it as easy as possible for those people to crack on and do what they're passionate about doing, and not put barriers or silly bureaucracy in their way, or make them fill out funding applications that take forever and a day and distract them, right? Or recruit them as volunteers to do for them, what the institution feels is important. So don't do harm. Really cheer on that space. In the second lane, there are things that communities could largely do themselves, but maybe with a little bit of help. And I think the trick is to make sure that that help is on tap, not on top. So it's not about ego, and it's not about power, and it's not about putting our logo on their work, but it's about cheering them on and being happy to serve. And the final lane is where there are things that communities need professionals to do for them, and their expertise and their knowledge and their science and their years and years of learning and wisdom are really, really critical. But the point is this: I think most of our professions and most of our institutions are stuck in the third lane. And what we want to try to do is support them to think much more about being facilitators of the first 2 lanes. Because if they do that, they'll be in a much better position to figure out what it is that's needed of them in the third lane. You can't know what a community needs until you. It's a great question. And I think it begins by recognizing that if we've been in a mode of trying to bring answers to people we see as clients or as passive or as needy, then the first thing to do is change the nature of that conversation and think about ourselves more as the people who bring better questions rather than always bringing the answers or the programs or the services. So I think it's interesting going back historically to the 70s when we had patch social workers and beat bobbies and our GPs, were in local places, to the 80s and Thatcherism, and so much damage was actually done because what we did was we pulled the professions away from place and kind of almost syndicalized them with other professions and specialisms. And I think the professions have done the very best they can do to provide the best solutions they can. But I think the key piece is to go back to being more place-based, to being more focused on community building and changing the nature of how we actually get alongside communities. And that's going to take a bit of time, because I think if communities have grown to see themselves as receivers of services, then there's a whole process by which we're going to have to relocate that authority, because that's the problem. If authority for creating and producing solutions is all over on one side of the institutions, that's not fair to the professions working in the system or to citizens. So somehow we've got to go through a process of relocating authority a little bit and actually starting to lift people up and feature the power of communities. So better questions, and also let's share the stories. Let's actually start telling the stories about what people are already doing in their neighborhoods to make things better. So one of the great starting points would be to go into each of the communities and invite local people to share stories about a time that they and their neighbors joined together to make things better. Because the answer to that question, those stories, are the treasure chest that actually show communities the latent power that they need to tap into. I think the other thing is to be really, really careful here, that what we're saying isn't that communities should pull themselves up by their bootstraps and do it all on their own. What we're saying is that there are two tools for social and economic change. One is community, the other is institutions. And as you so eloquently put it there, we've got to get them in right relationship. In the 80s, they went out of right relationship. And it became kind of a dominant thing where the triangle of the institution almost eclipsed the power of the circle. And what I think we have to do is turn the triangle on its back, make it like an ice cream cone, so it lifts up the community, which is the circle, and it's really of service. I think that's what most professionals want to do. That's the way they want to work. So another thing within our system we really have to do is change the nature of how we're asking professionals to work and free them up to work in local communities at the speed of trust and to follow their instincts and listen to the relationships, rather than following bureaucratic rules or procurement regulations that are kind of they're pushing them away from following their instincts. So I think that's something that really needs to be thought very carefully about. How do you change commissioning and procurement in your county so that good professionals who know better aren't being pulled into key performance indicators which push them away from doing what it is they want to do? So I think at all those levels, if we could do that, and we are, I know it's doable because we're doing it in other places, we'd see massive change. But we have to not be in a rush. This takes time. And there has to be a commitment to do this over at least the next decade. So there's no quick wins or kind of shortcuts to this. It's taken us 30 years to cause this damage. We should be prepared to invest the next generation in creating new possibilities. That's a great question. And again, as you say, it's not either or, it's both and. So I think community is however people experience it, and we should be pluralistic about it. So I don't want to say it's place-based only, but nor do I want to lose the opportunity for affinity groups or protected communities to benefit from the potential that place-based ways of working also open up. It's interesting, when you think about protected communities in terms of economic possibilities and, opportunities to receive services, place and being thoughtful about safe places and places of welcome are important. But often many of the protected communities that I care deeply about and want to be in solidarity have experienced a huge amount of trauma in growing up, and a lot of exclusion actually in communities of place, in villages and neighborhoods and so forth. And I want to be sensitive to that. So absolutely, to your point, it isn't either or. What is really striking to me is that when we get serious about inclusion work and welcoming those that we have pushed to the edge of whatever community we live in, it's really, really striking to me to listen to people describe what they care about enough to act on, what they imagine a good life would look like. And over again, what I notice is that people will definitely talk about issues and they'll talk about their concerns, but they'll also talk about many other things that go beyond that affinity group. So, for example, in Leeds, I remember having a conversation with a gentleman who was a member of a recovery community. And his point to me was that this community, which was a peer support community, was like it saved his life on more than one occasion. And so he didn't want to in any way minimize it. It's hugely important to his well-being. But what he said is that there are so many hours in his week where it's not filled with that peer group. It's not filled with experiences and supports from within that community. And so his question was, how can I have diverse community experiences of place, of affinity, of passion, of interest, of music, of whatever? So that's what he wanted. And it was interesting. One of the questions I asked him was, on your street, how many people have you a connection to? And he had no connections whatsoever. And I said, is that something you'd like? And he said, yes, but I don't even know where to begin. So we began that journey, and he now is deeply connected. And I guess my point to your question is, like you say, it's not either. I mean, thinking across a 24-hour, 7-day week, I think community means many, many different things to individuals. And my suggestion is that we open out the possibility that people define what a good life looks like for them, hour to hour, day to day, week to week, and that they have as many entry points to great experiences and to reciprocal relationships. For me, the definition of community is the place that I missed on the day I don't show up. So wherever that might be, let's create those spaces. The other thing that perhaps I'd add to this, and it's broadening your question slightly, is I'm really struck by the number of groups who would say, we're a group by identity or affinity, that would say to me, one of the things that they're most concerned about is the lack of welcome and the lack of inclusion in broad-based society. And I'm really interested in, if we're in places that are not creating a welcome for the stranger, what might we do to ensure that our communities create a culture of care and welcome for everybody? Because I think that is important work, so that we're not saying to groups that don't feel welcome in those spaces, go and form a community separate from the places where you live, but we're saying do both, and many other things besides. So I'm very, very interested in working in communities, not where we have stronger leaders, but where we have deeper associational life, and where people are cultivating the ability to welcome everybody, and not just those that look like them or worship like them or sound like them. Does that answer your question? Good.